I am a longtime PSP owner, and as a result, I was reluctant to get a PS Vita recently because outside of that smallish PS Vita library that I get has 1,000 games in, but there were only so many titles I was going to realistically want to check out, and I discovered there was a lot more than I even thought there were for me out there. But I had thought that, the PSP and the PS1 compatibility on this thing was really not a big point of emphasis for me. I had a PSP, I could play those games on there. Sure, the Vita screen's a little bit bigger, but on face value, I was not at all excited about playing PSP games on my Vita. In fact, I loaded up with some Vita games initially, didn't even bother to put any PS1 or PSP games on there until I found out about some of the great enhancements that games have when playing on the Vita. I want to start by admitting that the PlayStation 1 is one of the most commonly emulated systems today on cheaper handhelds or on just even other video game platforms, because even the 3DS can emulate the PS1 pretty well these days. But the reality is you're not going to get the great control scheme, the potential for dual analog stick play unless you're doing it on a Vita, because very few of those cheaper handhelds actually have two analog sticks. And while 99% of PlayStation 1 games do not require a dual analog stick setup, because after all, the DualShock was introduced later and pretty much every game is compatible with just simply using the D-pad, much past, Ape Escape and a few others that required the analog sticks, it does enhance a lot of the games. Being able to play them with one analog stick, in some cases two, if it has camera support, is really a big step up over just using that D-pad and an automated camera, in addition to the fact that, again, it unlocks games like Ape Escape that do require the dual analog sticks. Also, it always confused me when I was younger why there was an L1 and R1 button on the PSP, but it didn't have the L2 and R2 that it really needed to properly map out. And for that reason, you either had games replacing it with a sort of two-button setup to get the L2 and R2, or they just flat out were not compatible, and that was oftentimes the case. However, on the PS Vita, you have the opportunity to use the back touchpad as the L2 and R2 button, and that's not exactly super convenient, so instead, you're able to remap any of the buttons on the gamepad. So something like Mega Man Legends, where the lock-on button is in a really odd place, being back there on the trigger, and you have to use that non-stop, being able to remap the controls for something like Mega Man Legends makes the game be immensely more playable than it would be even on standard hardware, because you're able to remap the controls to something that fits not only the Vita, but just being overall more modernized. You wouldn't think that the PSP would benefit from any of these things, because after all the controls that are on the PSP are also on the Vita, but the addition of that second analog stick does come into play with some games. There's a lot of games on the PSP that utilize either D-pad camera controls, or for something like Star Wars Battlefront 2, it uses the face buttons on the right side, your X, square, triangle, and circle, in order to navigate the camera. And some games, even like Grand Theft Auto, had you pressing a button and using the analog stick together in order to navigate the camera that way. Ultimately, if the camera is navigated by either the face buttons or the D-pad, you can remap that using the built-in PS Vita settings, even on just a stock PS Vita, in order to have the second analog stick serve as the camera controls, which is much more feasible to use because you don't have both your character movement and your camera controls being used by your left thumb, or you're not using up the face buttons in order to navigate the camera that way. The Flow, who made a ton of different homebrew content for the PS Vita, even released a remastered control patch that allows you to patch in right analog stick functionality into games that otherwise wouldn't have it natively, because the buttons required in order to remap the controls aren't just a simple D-pad versus analog stick comparison, and instead, again, like Grand Theft Auto, maybe it's you gotta hold one of the trigger buttons and move the joystick at the same time, and this plugin takes all of that complicated nature of trying to transfix it and just puts it simply onto the right thumbstick by having this plugin enabled. The PSP games this is available on include both the Grand Theft Auto Liberty City Stories and Vice City Stories, Resistance Retribution, the Splinter Cell Essentials, which is kind of like the Splinter Cell Double Agent game from home consoles, Tomb Raider, Prince of Persia, Kingdom Hearts, the Metal Gear Solid games, both Peace Walker and Portable Ops, the Warriors game that Rockstar put out, as well as Tony Hawk Project 8. Unfortunately, it does not seem like the Flow is working on adding any more titles to this collection, but nonetheless, that's a pretty good list of PSP titles, many of which were games that also, maybe were console ports, so they had console versions. To be able to play those on your PS Vita with dual analog support is really awesome. Of course, these aren't the only classic PlayStation games that got ported to the Vita, as there were collections for PS2 titles like Sly Cooper, Ratchet & Clank, God of War, as well as Jak and Daxter, which is one that notoriously runs pretty poor, but can be enhanced using the Vita graphics app to actually run relatively well if you put it at the right resolution. And why they didn't just launch it in that resolution in the first place, with that resolution shortcoming and better overall performance, is beyond me. So if you have a Vita and have not yet tried out the enhanced controls the Flow made available for modded systems on some of these PSP games, I highly recommend you check it out, because I think you'll quickly find you're having a good time with them. And even PSP games like Battlefront 2 without the plugin are still really great to play, because you're able to use that second analog stick in a way you would otherwise not be able to, which makes a shooter like Battlefront 2 be seen in a whole new light on a mobile platform. Thank you guys for watching. I'm Bailey, and I will see you in the next video.